Okay, we can start. So, dear participants here in the room and online around the world, esteemed colleagues, dear panelists, it is Wednesday, 29 September 2021, and I have the honor, after a few practical issues, to welcoming you to this afternoon session, Together in Pain, Together in Gain, how digital technology turned possible economic chaos into a mere bump on the road to growth and prosperity, and helped us set out a brand new course for international trade. My name is Kevin Verbelen. I am expert international trade and the company lawyer at Agoria, the Association of Technologically Inspired Companies in Belgium. And Agoria is a proud and active member of Digital Europe, which is the leading trade association of digitally transforming industries in Europe and the host of this panel. It's in my function as chair of the Digital Trade Policy Group of Digital Europe that I was asked to moderate this panel on how digital technology has positively contributed to avoid deeper economic and social havoc at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, and how it is a game changer out of this crisis, not just for developed, but perhaps also in particular for developing countries. I'm not alone to discuss this important topic. In fact, I'm merely the moderator. I'm joined here in the room by Daphne Dernsong, Global Policy Director at Philips. Philips is a global leading company in diagnostic imaging, image-guided therapy, patient monitoring, and health informatics. And Daphne's expertise is also built up thanks to her prior activities in the public sector, in different ministries of the Dutch government, in particular, economic affairs and health. I'm also joined here in the room by Pascal Kernes, Managing Director of the European Services Forum, which is the voice of the European services industry in international trade and investment negotiations. And Pascal is well known here in Geneva and in the wider world of international trade, as he is an active member of different domestic advisory groups. And he's also an advisor to the EU Commission WTO conferences. And online, we're joined by Michel Chivunga, CEO and founder of the Global Policy House. In this regard, she's a true global expert in blockchain and digital transformation. And this becomes clear also from her other roles in the African and international community. Michel is also a senior government advisor to Bermuda, the African Union, the United Nations, the International Chamber of Commerce, the B and G20 group, and this house, the World Trade Organization. She's ranked among the top 10 women in blockchain in Africa and top 40 global Fintech for Good fellows linked to the United Nations. And finally, we also have online with us Dr. Alistair Tempest, Chief Executive Officer of the E-Commerce Forum of Africa and the International Omni Retail Markets Association. He is a member of the Financial Services Control Authority's E-Commerce Advisory Group and the African Union's Digital Economy Committee. So a very distinguished panel, I can say. But without any further ado, let us dive into the topic of this session. And let us start with you, Daphne. And perhaps I'm starting with stating the obvious by saying that COVID pandemic has been tremendous in all aspects, in a negative way, let's say. It has had a huge economic and social impact, and it definitely also has had, unfortunately, too many personal impact. And it certainly has put a lot of stress on healthcare systems around the world. Thanks to digital technology and digital innovation, we have been able to avoid even worse scenarios. So perhaps in that aspect, Daphne, to you, and with the questions, whether you could enlighten us, whether how IT has assisted us during the pandemic and how IT can help us increase resilience in our healthcare systems.
Yes, thank you, Kevin. Indeed, like you said, the COVID-19 pandemic has really stress tested our global healthcare system to its very core. And it has exposed many of the weaknesses and vulnerabilities that were already in place in the global healthcare system. But fortunately, with the help of the digital technologies, we have been able to address some of those weaknesses during the crisis. And healthcare organizations really had to adapt very quickly to this new situation. And as an industry, together with other stakeholders, fortunately, we were able to support them in doing so by really speeding up innovations and implementing them at an unprecedented speed, I would say. Because from the onset of the COVID pandemic, we saw that the usual in-person meetings that healthcare professionals are having with their patients were completely upended. Um, and many of the healthcare facilities were also forced to suspend their non-COVID care. And even when they were able to keep their operations up and running, they saw a huge decline in patients because people were simply too afraid to go to a hospital. So that was really a huge drive for the uptake of telehealth solutions because it really enabled physicians to continue support to their patients by online consultations. And that really reduced the stress on the healthcare system because it made sure that people did not have to visit the overstressed and overburdened hospitals with the risk of infection for other patients and staff, of course. And we also saw a huge uptake in what we call remote patient monitoring solutions, because most of the COVID patients were actually quarantined at home. But because of the remote solutions, we were able to monitor them in their home situation, which also prevented unnecessary visits to hospitals. But also inside the hospital, we saw a huge uptick in what we call electronic intensive care units. So basically, intensivists, together with critical care nurses, they are in the hub and they're supported by high definition cameras, telemetry, data visualization, and they are able to monitor um, several patients, regardless of where that patient is located. And by doing that, they can support the frontline colleagues that are actually physically with the patients. And with the support of algorithms, they could alert to the actual status of patients. So for example, if they see that a patient is deteriorating, they can proactively deliver care. But also if they see that a patient is improving and stabilizing, they can quickly move that patient to the regular ward so that the very scarce ICU capacity can be available for more acute patients. And in doing that, we were also able to reduce the pressure on the frontline workers because it also diminishes the need for them to actually go in and out of the ICU, because we have all seen the pictures of our healthcare professionals completely covered in PPE and having to take it off, which is a very lengthy procedure. And also in the Netherlands, very early on in the onset of the pandemic, we were able, together with the Ministry of Health and a few of the leading hospitals in the Netherlands, to develop an online portal that enabled hospitals to seamlessly share patient data for COVID patients. And that enabled them to transfer patients from one location to another. And that really reduced the burden on the healthcare system because it prevented local overload of specific ICU facilities. So these are a number of examples of how digital technology was really able to relieve the burden on the healthcare system. But it has made very clear some of the weaknesses that were already in place in our healthcare system. So going forward, it is really vital that we make sure that our healthcare system becomes more resilient. And that is even regardless of pandemics, because even though we can be very glad that we have seen life expectancy increase over the past few decades, that also comes with an increased disease burden of chronic diseases. And going forward, these digital solutions will help us to further bring healthcare closer to the communities in lower resource settings, which will enable access to care on the one hand, but on the other hand, it will also be able to reduce cost and relieve the pressure on hospitals and intensive care units. But also, through digital solutions, like I said, we've been talking about technology for quite a bit here in the COVID crisis, but the most important resource really turned out to be our healthcare professionals. And they're in short supply, and that will only become worse over the next decade. By the end of this decade, we will be globally 15 million healthcare providers short. So we really need to make sure that those healthcare providers that we do rely on are equipped with the best possible technology to make them perform their duties as efficiently as possible. And another thing that became abundantly clear in the COVID pandemic is that there is a lack of interoperability between data pools, which really prevents us from learning from each other. So we really need to make sure that we have integrated data and IT systems to be able to connect all the information that is available globally and learn from that, so that we can really have an impact on global public health going forward. So that would be the main ask, I think, going forward, is that we really need to ensure international data flows, because for the healthcare sector to thrive, it is really critical that we have this access and we can work together and learn to really improve our global public health system.
Fantastic. And thank you. Thank you, Daphne. That was very insightful, and we can definitely come back later with a few more questions to you as well. But let us look at our panelists that have joined us online, and perhaps we start with you, Alistair. One of the reasons that you are not here is that, of course, the COVID situation is still very much among us, not just in Africa, but also here in Geneva. Yet, thanks to digital technology and the free flow of data, we're able to have this hybrid panel. And so perhaps in that aspect, it's interesting to see how you, from your place in Africa, can perhaps enlighten us a little bit on how things are evolving with regard to digital technology on the African continent. So Alistair, could you shed a bit of a light on the potential of Africa's digital economy and the unavoidable challenges that it will bring as well?
Thank you very much indeed, Kevin. And thank you to Digital Europe for inviting me to speak today. I thought, because there are two of us speaking from Africa, Michelle and myself, that I would just quickly give an overview as I talk of some of the issues to remind people of the size of Africa and the issues that we face. So if I can share my screen, I hope I can share my screen. And I can share my screen. Excellent, great. This is Africa, and you can see that it's very large. It includes the whole of the United States, China, etc. We are talking about a continent with 55 completely different countries. After many years of preparation, the African Free Trade Area, which is also known as the CFTA, was launched mid last year after delays with COVID, and inevitably the negotiations have now started, but inevitably that not all African states have actually joined it yet. There are only 39 who've ratified so far. But slowly but surely, this is growing. Briefly, the initial intention is to remove 90% of tariffs and tackle the problem of non-tariff barriers between African states. And these tasks are supported by protocols on specific areas, such as investment and e-commerce. Pascal will be talking about the results of the JSI discussions in the World Trade Organization later. What we're told by the Secretariat of the CFTA is that they will base their protocol on those on those discussions. So we watch that with great interest. And also there are other attempts to encourage harmonization of national regulations through conventions on things like consumer protection, data protection, intellectual property, and other such issues, which are key to the future of the African Free Trade Area. So if I look at the next slide, sorry, big problem, which gives you some idea of the size of some of the issues that we're facing. The main challenges that we have as e-commerce is a lack of transport infrastructure, the digital divide, which is very big, and I'll get back to that in a moment, the cost of data in some countries, bureaucracy, of course, and red tape, the absence of regulation to underpin trust in e-commerce, very important, the lack of payment systems, and in the case of cross-border payments, currency fluctuations and central bank rules on remunerations from foreign countries and in foreign currencies. Michel will be looking at, a lot at some of these issues in a few minutes. The need for investment and the lack of trade data. There's certainly absolutely no absence of entrepreneurship in Africa. Yesterday, I was having a meeting, a physical meeting even, with a new South African payment solution called Moja, which is aimed at banking the unbanked. Moja is run by a company that also specializes in building smart townships, which I'd never come across before. And they include healthcare, they include education, they include manufacturing within their townships that they're building. And they're funded totally by local investment. As far as we're concerned in e-commerce, obviously the COVID lockdowns have given us a big kick forward and have in turn helped to drive other digital solutions. Just as a quick example of that, in Kenya, in Egypt, and in Nigeria, there are companies that were founded pre-COVID to cut out the middleman between farmers and retailers. Those have now gone further to provide farm-to-table services. And those three companies, Twiga, MaxAB, and Agripe, help farmers with professional assistance to grow the right crops at the right time. They all have received investment over the last 18 months, and two are expanding into neighboring countries. And of course, that raises the issue of investments in the digital economy. Most of foreign investment in Africa comes from North America and Europe, of course. Very little is generated so far from Africa itself. An investigation in 2019 by the UK's Guardian newspaper showed that investors preferred to invest in African companies that were headed by either Americans or Europeans. Oh dear, this is a very sad state of affairs. On another issue, which is, can be more easily solved, there's a serious lack of trade data available, which makes it difficult for investors to assess the market that they're investing in. For example, the only consistent source of data for e-commerce in Africa is the European firm Statistica, which does a great job estimating e-commerce business to consumer in the top few African countries, but gives very little indication at all on B2B, business to business e-commerce, and no data at all on the very active C2C, which includes obviously small and medium-sized companies, online markets, which are, in our view, growing very fast because of COVID. The great challenges that we have faced is transport, that we face is transport. That COVID has just exacerbated that problem. Partly, obviously, it's a case of better roads and rail links, which are going to take a lot of money and serious infrastructure investment. But we do have sea and air cargo. COVID grounded the airlines, although Ethiopian Airlines pivoted very fast to adapting their passenger planes for cargo. Prices, however, have increased significantly. Sea cargo, UNCTAD estimated that sea cargo from China to West Africa in the last 18 months has increased by 400%. And that makes all this thing of value-added chains extremely important. But it may help with CFTA, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Finally, let me turn to fintech. This point will be obviously considered by Michel in depth, but I'd like to stress that when it does come to fintech, Africa has been way out in the lead. This has been particularly the case of digital payment solutions, which aim to bank the unbanked by introducing payment solutions which cost a minimal amount to the consumer. And that is, of course, very important for e-commerce and for commerce in general. So, ladies and gentlemen, you may ask, why are the developments in Africa of interest to Digital Europe? Well, what happens in Africa today will have a direct impact on Europe tomorrow in several ways, and vice versa. The most obvious is the spillover of various digital economy technologies, particularly advances in fintech, which have already revolutionized banking in many parts of Africa, and which fit very nicely into the new ideas of open banking in Europe. Another aspect is the adoption of the single market approach by the CFTA. That should develop over time into a strong African economy as an active partner to the global trading blocs. So the CFTA will provide economies of scale for entrepreneurs who wish to sell at a distance across frontiers within the African continent. If that African internal single market is permitted to develop and flourish, we will see, I'm absolutely convinced, we will see a renaissance of African sourced and manufactured products, employing the youth as well as women and other traditionally disadvantaged groups. The AU rules
Alistair?
of origin must be permitted. Yep, I'm just coming to the end.
Okay.
Must be permitted to protect these nascent markets. My closing remark, therefore, in these hallowed halls of open trade is an appeal for Africa to be allowed to develop its industry for the good of its people and to the ultimate benefit of global trade. Thank you very much indeed for listening. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Alistair. And indeed, there is so much to say about the evolutions. You have mentioned a lot of opportunities, a lot of potential. We also stressed a few, if not huge challenges for Africa. So in that way, I think we can actually indeed link very nicely to Michel. If we look at or based a little bit on what Alistair has said, what in your view are the key factors, let's say, that can further help boost digital transformation in Africa?
Yes, no, thank you so much, Kevin. Firstly, greetings to the world. I think the world is watching. So very, very nice to be here with you. It's fantastic to return back to the public forum, even though virtually this time, and of course, digital has enabled that. I think, you know, as somebody who's been in the digital economy for quite some time, I think for us, there's a flip side to what's happened with COVID. I think in the digital, you know, those of us in the digital economy, we've seen this as a massive opportunity, really, and as a positive shift in our industry to actually really make a difference to people's lives. So that's that bit is very, very exciting. But we do actually have quite a lot of work, as you've heard from my two, you know, esteemed speakers before me. That, you know, as much as digitalization and digital, you know, has really played a very core role in terms of supporting economies throughout COVID, there still remains a big gap and a big divide. You know, at my company, Global Policy House, we're really focused on closing that digital divide. And we're working towards that. And it's very important that we collaborate with everybody to try and achieve that. And now when we think about, I just wanted to contextualize a little bit. We are now, today finding ourselves in a world where just over 33% of the world's population has been vaccinated. So that's about 6 billion, vaccines that have been given out. But there's such a big divide again when it comes to kind of vaccine distribution. If you look at Africa, I think only something like 2%. Has gone to Africa. So, the massive challenges I think ahead of us that we need to think about. Now, in terms of what factors, as you were asking, Kevin, I think there's a number of factors. One, we do need to look into data, right? We need to be very, very careful in terms of really analyzing how can we utilize data better. Even in the situation around COVID, a lot of economies were very reliant on data. And that easy flow of data, as we've talked and heard about already, is very, very important in order for us to make those decisions that we need to make around what's actually happening. So where do we come in? I mean, for us, obviously, we've been looking at those digital tools that you've heard about that have helped during COVID. So I'm talking about, sort of emerging technology solutions, including things like blockchain, including things like artificial intelligence, machine learning, using drones, to deliver medication, using drones to deliver food during COVID, reaching people through mobile phones, right? And transmitting money through mobile phones because we can't physically move and get to the banks is the world in which we are living in. So we have all transitioned into what I call a platform economy. And the platform economy doesn't necessarily have to remain as a platform economy, but I think we're shifting towards the world where we're going to have this hybrid mix of where we are interacting through platforms, but we're also interacting, face to face. And it's important that we ensure that every part of the world is supported in that transition. And this is why I think for us, we have invested quite heavily at looking at things like, sort of digital skills upskilling for people. We've looked at, trying to educate around actually what are these tools? How can we use blockchain? What does blockchain actually mean for us? Is it relevant for these economies right now? Or should we be focusing about trying to make sure we have the right infrastructure, we've got the right connectivity, as Alistair was saying. Very, very important for Africa in terms of, having that soft and hard infrastructure in the first place before we dig into looking at things like blockchain and other technologies. But as Alistair has said, indeed, Africa is very much ahead when it comes to fintech. And I smile because there's just been so much activity. And it actually makes me very proud because I've got quite a lot of peers who I know have been running businesses in Africa, who I know are closing those deals and getting the investments that they need. But there is still a big gap, right? We still have a lot of women-led businesses that are not getting the financing that they need. We still have a lot of very, very digitally savvy young population in Africa that can build these solutions, overnight, but they do need the support and they do need the investment. So I think we need to focus quite heavily around supporting them a bit better around, yes, upskilling even in terms of new areas. So teaching around blockchain, teaching around artificial intelligence and how they can embed that in their products and services that they're producing. Now, for me, the biggest challenge, I think the international trade ecosystem, one of the biggest challenges it faces is actually the lack of trust and the lack of transparency. We need to bring in trust and transparency within the trade ecosystem. And in order to do that, yes, we can leverage technology. Yes, we can use blockchain, for example, to look at, tracking and traceability and looking at, traceability of goods and products moving from A to B. We saw what happened with COVID, with the supply chain. Supply chain in some scenarios was almost, a standstill. In some cases, with people not knowing where do I source my PPE that we heard about, which is so critical for our healthcare workers. Where do I source the medication? How do I get my vaccination? We're still in that boat, by the way. How do you distribute vaccinations, to people in the rural areas, for example? How do you know that we've vaccinated everybody? How you, and back to data again, how you collecting that data, how you using the data to analyze, to make decisions, to move forward is very, very important. I think that's where you can start to think, okay, maybe we can start to utilize these digital tools. And indeed, they have been utilized, new solutions are starting to be developed now, to support exactly what I've talked about. The other thing I really wanted to point out in terms of other factors that we can draw on is actually when you think about even payments, which Alistair picked up on, payments is a very important issue. Cross-border trade is very important, especially when it comes to the continental free trade. We are trying to create an interregional trade market within Africa. but also we're trying to encourage, other countries and other parts of the world to trade and do business with Africa. In order for that to happen, we need to have obviously very innovative, payment systems. We have to have interoperability and standards in place in order for us to actually take advantage of that end-to-end digitalization, which is needed, which we know is going to help to, produce more productive supply chains, if you like. So how do we go about doing that? Very, very important that we can collaborate and work together as neighbors, be it when we're looking at regulations, be it when we're looking at actually new solutions and new innovative kind of payments solutions, including things like, central bank digital currency that is being discussed around almost every central bank around the world. It's very important. Do those actually matter, for example, for Africa? In which parts of Africa can we benefit from digital currency? In fact, we pioneered around currency and digital money already, take M-Pesa, take Kenya, so we know this stuff, but we need to be able to scale, and we need to make sure that there's interoperability across systems to make this work and to make it a bit more useful, especially within sort of the trade circles. The other area I wanted to quickly point on again was very much around within trade. I think the challenge has been that we need to support more small, medium enterprises at the end of the day. Trade is about people. Trade is about making sure that we are connecting the dots and those people are actually getting value from supply chains. If we're not able to support the small, medium enterprises, if we're not able to equip them with the right skills and the digital tools, we can have digital tools, but if people don't know how to use them, then it is very, very difficult for them to actually leverage those tools. So it's important that we invest into small, medium enterprises, important that we look at legislation and the laws that exist and make sure they are 21st century laws that actually are fit for purpose to be used in the digital era, I think is what I would say. And just kind of my final closing remarks, because I know I'll pick this up later on in the questions, is, Africa is kind of very much driven by, for example, agriculture. We need more manufacturing. 60% of the employment of farming employment resides within sub-Saharan Africa. We need to support the more farming industry. We need to support manufacturing. And a lot of the technologies I mentioned and I talked about are actually quite well fit to actually make life a little bit easier for the farmers, for the small, medium enterprises, for the entrepreneurs who are trying to connect with the rest of the world. So we no longer have to worry about being physically present in different parts of the world to do business. We can use blockchain or other, blockchain powered tools that enable you to connect and cut out middlemen, cut out the costs, that come with, interacting, in the normal way. So it's very, very important that we start to really not just talk about these technologies, but start to understand where can we actually apply them and whose benefit are we actually doing this for. So just in closing, I think, one of the things that I would recommend that we focus on is, of course, yes, we talk about the digital economy, but actually we need to be able to understand where are we applying what, and what are the benefits. And then we need to look more closely around investment and making sure that we can, source sustainable impact investing to support these more strategic and scalable projects that are going to grow economies, that are going to help us rebuild and build back better, making sure that we're not leaving people behind. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. And indeed, I think that we have now heard 3 speakers already during this panel, one with a very particular sectoral view, and then 2 with a regional view. And I think it's actually perfect then to come to Pascal and bring back the discussion to Geneva, let's say, because obviously we've heard many opportunities, but perhaps Pascal, if I turn to you, what in your idea is at the multilateral level, what we need right now? What are the elements that we need in order to facilitate the digital technology and the trade in digital technology? I think about the e-commerce that has been mentioned, the data flows that has been mentioned. What do you think at the multilateral level is what we need? And I will turn my screen because apparently there is also a problem there. So I give this to you, Pascal.
Thank you very much, Kevin, and thank you to all my co-panelists here to provide these very interesting insights. So I've been given the task to try to connect all what has been said to this house in which we are sitting, which is the WTO. So I think it is important that if we want to move on the world needs global rules for digital global, because the digitalization is everywhere, and international trade is completely digitalized. I don't think it exists one single transaction that cross a border which can do without a computer talking to another computer. So we are now in need of rules for digitally related services and goods, and therefore I'm going to try to summarize and make an overview of what is happening or not here. Let's start by saying that there is a WTO working program on WTO on e-commerce since 1998, but that has not delivered any new market access or any new rules so far. But it has been very helpful to keep up countries talking to each other on this subject. But how can we move on? Because it was complicated to have a result in Buenos Aires at MC11, many countries decided that we need to try to group ourselves with the countries of the willing and see whether we can move this issue forward. And they decided, so 71 countries joined this joint statement initiative, as they call it, on e-commerce. E-commerce is a word here in town in the WTO jargon, but that's really about digital trade. These negotiations, so it was December 2017 in Buenos Aires. They prepared the work for more or less 1 year, and the negotiations started in 2019. The negotiations were going fast, but unfortunately, the COVID crisis came in and therefore slowed down a bit the process. But nevertheless, there are some progress. I'm going to mention them soon. Because progress were made, other countries joined the initiative, and now there are 86 countries around the table, which is gathering something like 80% of the world e-commerce would be covered by all of these countries. So that's really positive. But indeed, talking about Africa earlier, unfortunately, still yet there are too many African countries which are not part of this initiative. Let me try to summarize in 6 issues what are the main elements of these negotiations which are going on. The first one is what I'm calling the facilitating trade and build digital trust. It is about the major article. I'm going to go through this. The second aspect is about, is it possible to improve commitments in regulatory disciplines around the e-commerce digitally enabled services? Another important issue is in the discussion in the GCSI and in the WTO, but is going to be crucial in the future for that is no custom duties on electronic transmission. And there is a moratorium on this, but we will see where we go. Another aspect is about protection of intellectual property. It's probably not labeled by many countries that way, but that is the way I'd like to put it. An issue which will need to be solved at a point in time is we would like to get non-discrimination against digital product or digital services, but the definition of that is key. And to conclude, as Kevin mentioned, the very important issue about cross-border data flows. Let's start with where we are now and where some progress have been made and talk about concrete issues. 6 articles have been already finalized among the 86 countries, and hopefully 3 or 4 others are going to be done before the ministerial in 7 weeks. Among that, we talk here about there is a need to have global rules for mutual recognition of digital entities. So a company X in a real world need to be also identified digitally and certified, and that is an important thing to do, and that has been done. E-authentication, e-signature, e-invoicing, consumer protection, spam regulation, so anti-solicited regulation against unsolicited messages. Progress needs to be done also, an article in this agreement on online facilitation of e-payment, which has been mentioned by my colleagues earlier. Maybe progress on open government data. So all government are running many data of all the different administrations. Maybe that could be shared by everyone so that the big data effect can be multiplied. Paperless trading, and here, having your custom declaration on electronic format. All of those issues are very important, and we believe we can move on this. Rules for also express shipment. The logistic on e-commerce is really important. And we have seen some part of the supply chain disrupted during the crisis. We know this is really important. So there are some issues which are going on. They are long, they are complicated. They need to go to the details, and some progress are taking place. So that is good. And there is a very good atmosphere into these negotiations. So I think that is important to say also, and to encourage the negotiation to go on. But that is only the first of the 6 elements I have mentioned to you. And when we go to the other part, the more we go, the more complicated it seems to be. So we will see whether it's going to be possible. For instance, to improve commitments in the regulatory disciplines, there is something which is going to be a very good result for the ministerial conference here for MC12, that we hope to have a final result. It's nearly done, so I don't. It's not even more a hope now. It's just a hope. It's just normally putting that into paper on services domestic regulation. So all countries in their own countries have domestic regulation. Some of them have an impact on the digital aspect of e-commerce regulation, etc. So 65 countries will have accept to take disciplines in the WTO. But there are many other aspects which is related to e-commerce, which are not part of this discipline yet. For instance, we have in the UK around 1995 adopted a reference paper on telecommunication services. Actually, that was 1998 rather. This is a nearly 25 years old paper. It would need to be updated, but there are not so many countries actually interested to regulate this now and to update it to the new world. This was the paper which was actually done at a time where internet was at its infancy. So we consider it would be good to update it. Another issue is market access on what I'm calling the e-commerce related services. In the Uruguay round, only a few countries have taken some commitment under the market access for services, which would be very essential for improving e-commerce in the world. So IT, of course, telecommunication services, logistics services, e-payment, all of that, not all countries in the WTO have taken commitments. If we could improve the commitments through the WTO and market access, that would be interesting, but unfortunately, only a few countries are actually pushing for this effort of market access increasing. So I'm not sure we're going to go much further in there. Let me come now to my third issue, which is no custom duties on electronic transmission. There is in the moratorium, there is in the working program on e-commerce, the countries every 2 years for every ministerial, supposedly, have adopted a moratorium that no country is going to levy some custom duties on the electronic transmission. So it's not about the tariff on goods which are crossing the borders, but on the electronic transmission. And at that time, in any case, it was not possible to levy these duties. Now, apparently, technically, it might be possible. And some countries are saying, well, this moratorium, maybe we should stop it and we should be allowed to raise some duties on electronic transmission. That is essentially India, South Africa, some countries in the African Union, Indonesia. But they consider that they are losing revenues. There are more importing than exporting, and therefore they would like to levy some custom duties on these transactions. We are trying to explain this is not a solution, because actually maybe you will see a little bit of revenues, but you're going to position yourself as a country where the goods are more expensive for importing from your countries, and therefore in the long run you might actually lose into the economic development. But that's the discussion which is going on there. On the other side, in the discussion of the GSI on e-commerce, they are actually talking about a permanent ban on custom duties on electronic transmission. And that has actually been enacted in many FTAs already by all the recent EU FTAs in the CPTPP and in many other part of FTAs. This is now impossible to raise duties on electronic transmission. So the world is already dividing on this. And I think something which is very important to explain here is that, like for the services domestic regulation disciplines, the country who is going to be in and improve its regulatory environment for e-commerce services is going to be a winner. Those who are going to stay outside, for whatever reason, the world is not going to wait for them. Digitalization of the economy is going to continue, and we are going to assist to an increase of the digital divide by those who are in and those who are out. And I think this message, should be really spread it out, because otherwise that might happen, actually. 2 minutes. So intellectual property rights here, it's about banning the possibility for the government to oblige companies to divulge their software code source. That's going to be complicated. And on the cross-border data flow here, it's about, can we agree on rules for banning localization requirements? Digital is about the interest of having something digital is that you avoid to go physically in a country to trade. If we cannot do that, it's going to be more complicated. But there is fight then what could be protected or not, where is the protection of personal data into that. So there is a long debate on all of these issues. So it is not the end of the road. It's going to be a long process still, but there are a good atmosphere. So let's hope something will come out of it. Thank you.
Super. And thank you, Pascal, for going quickly through 6 very important points. For the sake of time and hoping that we could perhaps take 1 or maybe 2 questions from the audience, let me come back to the panelists in perhaps in reverse order and ask you. I prepared 2 questions, but I will reduce it to 1. But I would give you all 2 minutes to answer that. And the question is that if you would be the advisor to the Director General of the WTO at this point in time for international trade and digital technology, what would be your advice going forward? Pascal?
Well, for me, clearly, our focus here is MC12, so the next ministerial conference in Geneva here. And my advice to Dr. Ngozi would be make sure that there is a ministerial conference, ministerial declaration. In there, make sure that the progress made into SI on electronic commerce is registered, and if possible, to get a path forward and indicate maybe a deadline for these negotiations. It's not about finishing by MC12, but making a clear pathway.
Thank you. Michelle?
Yes, no, thank you for that question. I mean, I have a long list, but I think I'll choose a few. I think certainly from my end, like I said, we really exist as a fintech, to create solutions. We are about finding solutions. And I would really urge that, there's more support that's directed towards small, medium enterprises like us, to help actually spur that economic growth that is needed. And we are really, small businesses and SMEs are really at the backbone of making that happen. So, following the challenge we've had, I think it's important that we invest in measures that support small, medium enterprise. These measures include, like we've heard, is the changing and updating of the laws. Ensuring that we can able to trade and do business in different markets because we have very clear regulatory space for us to play and to interact. Making sure that there's interoperability, between systems, like I say, making sure that there's clear standards in place in order for us to operate. And then the other thing I really wanted to highlight is also we need to think about, I know there's, Dr. Ngozi has been championing, the vaccine, equitable vaccines, and I really would make another plea to make sure that carries on. And in fact, we really need to focus on that quite heavily, especially when it comes to Africa, where there's such a big divide at the moment, is making sure that we can leverage even the tools that I talked about, including blockchain for even distribution of vaccines, because we have companies that can actually help to make sure that we are delivering, vaccinations, and we are collecting that data and making sure we're using the data to actually monitor to see what actually happened. And finally, to also, make a call for member states to actually find investments and look elsewhere for investments. There's other channels for investment, including, kind of decentralized finance world where we do have, kind of investments that we can channel towards helping with some of these solutions. So there's a whole new world where we can look at to find alternative sources of finance. I mean, just to give you a final stat, over 105 billion crypto went into Africa within 1 year, between July 2020 and June 2021. We can't afford to ignore that market anymore. We need to look at things like regulation and what that market actually means, because the small entrepreneurs and the businesses are looking elsewhere to find sources of revenue to enable them to trade and to do business. So really encourage that we look at other alternatives as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Alistair.
Thank you very much indeed. I utterly agree with everything that Michelle said. So she's left me nothing to say at all. Thank you. Just one or two very quick points. I think not only do we need vaccines in Africa to make sure that there's a level playing field, which there isn't, but also we need to look at how a vaccine passport can be created. I actually have both my vaccines, but I have a funny little piece of paper which no one would believe, certainly not the Swiss if I were to appear on the Swiss frontier. So we need to be much more aware of the passport attitude as element as well. So thank you very much indeed. And again, I support what Michelle said 100%.
Thank you, Alistair. And finally, Daphne.
Yeah, thank you. So from a medical technology industry perspective, throughout the pandemic, we have experienced that several trade restrictions were introduced by governments around the globe, and that seriously hampered the supply chain and operations of our companies, whether it was restrictions on the movement of people, sometimes for good reasons, restriction on movement of goods, forced localization because they were afraid that otherwise they would not have access to certain critical goods. And especially that last approach has led to huge inequities in the world, initially in the area of ventilators, but now we also see it on vaccines. So I think going forward, governments really need to eliminate restrictions on the manufacturing and distribution of health technology, whether it's import, export, custom and transit related, or related to public procurement. And they also need to promote critical global innovation. So I would call upon the Director General to really help and build international consensus so that we can have effective and practical initiatives that are really capable of leveraging our trade capabilities so that we can fight COVID-19 globally, but also going forward address other public health challenges that we will be facing in the near future. Back to you, Kevin.
Fantastic, and thank you, Daphne. I think that you all have given very good advice, and that I can only hope that your advice is taken up in consideration. We have a few minutes left, so I would go through some of the questions that we have received here, and perhaps Pascal, I would take one that was actually directed at you, or to you rather. The question comes from Richard Hill, and the question is: digital trade has been working fine since the 1990s, then called EDI, and has prospered ever since, including during the pandemic. So why are any new rules required, given that everything is working fine?
Well, thank you, Richard, for the question. I think if it were that easy, indeed, probably most of the companies would say, we don't need any new rules. The problem is that because it has now taken a huge part of the economy, governments start to be interested and they start to raise new barriers, which are making things more complicated for companies. And that is the reason why we believe it is necessary to have global rules, because some government, for instance, are now asking for localization requirement. They ask you, if you want to get access to a market, you need to have your server on the ground and you need to have established here so we have some control over what you're doing. Some countries are going to ask for new standards and you'll not be allowed to have access to their country if you don't use a certain standard. Other countries are going to ask a code source so that if you want to get access to the data of the citizen of that country, of the consumers of that country, they're going to ask you to provide the code source of the software they're using, and that, you know, it's complicated for the intellectual property rights and maybe slow down the innovation. Cybersecurity is an issue. Hacking and the spam, etc., are actually new barriers. Some will also argue that the EU GDPR for the regulation on data protection is a barrier. But at least in any case, that is measures that other countries are also going to already started to have new data protection regulation in other countries which are different, and the business have to adapt to any jurisdiction some different rules. So it would be better if we could have at least some harmonized rules at the minimum standard on this issue. So that might be part of the answer to that question.
Thank you, Pascal. There is another question, which I perhaps on the question that was posed, Daphne, I don't know whether you would like to add something with regard to this point.
Well, I completely agree with Pascal. I think he has mentioned a number
As a medical technology company and also almost a software company, of course, we do see these issues when it comes to forced data localization. You cannot imagine the amount of data that our devices globally generate in a day. So if we would not be able to send those data back to global hubs and to analyze them, and also increasingly we remotely service our equipment digitally, then we would have to set up facilities in every single country that forces us to do so. So yeah, as industry, we are concerned about some of the developments that we see, which we also call data protectionism, and we need rules in order to regulate that.
Okay, thank you, Daphne. We have just a few more minutes, so perhaps I turn to our two other panelists for one more question. Obviously need to pick one, but I will take this one. Would the panelists agree that African countries know what is good for them and should be given policy space to develop their own digital policies rather than being forced to accept policies that feel imposed to them?
Michelle, do you want to go first on that one? Shall I go first?
You go, Alistair, no problem. It's a good one.
It's a good one, isn't it? I mean, marvelous. The African countries have not done themselves any favors by staying out of the GSI. That is for sure. And so there are, I think, 5 countries that are in, including some of the very important ones, but a lot have stayed out. And it would be very good if they got into and engaged in that process. Now, they may well say that, okay, that process is now going to come into the African Free Trade Area and that we're going to discuss it there. So that might be the way of doing it. But I think some of the issues, particularly the question of data localization, which, by the way, is not just about data protection, but it is about any data that is being created by companies or even by government. We are actually now seeing a discussion happening in Africa. So the African Union had a discussion last week on the subject. There was a report that was created beforehand to give some ideas, etc. And I'm hoping that that will continue. And certainly I'm sure that Michelle and I will make as much noise as we can at the African Union to ensure that that discussion continues. But it is, of course, a new issue. Are we able to look after ourselves in Africa? Yes, we are. We're not children. We are not. We don't need a nanny state. Thank you very much indeed. In fact, we've had too much of a nanny state. We've had colonization for far too long, and this, is something which we would feel, I think, to be somewhat patronizing. So therefore, and the GDPR is patronizing. The European Union has been extremely patronizing, European Commission, on it. There is the Council of Europe Convention 108, use that. Don't use the GDPR. It's not for Africa. It was created for Europe. Let Europe use it. Thank you.
Yeah, I can add a little bit to what Alistair was saying. I think,
we have 2 minutes left, so I just want to add that.
Sure, no problem. I won't be that long. I think, when it comes to is Africa capable of doing, its own absolutely 100%. I think if anybody has been, keeping pace with what's happening in Africa, you will recognize that Africa is driving quite a lot of, not just necessarily shifts within the African continent, but actually globally as well. So for me, I have 100% faith, that Africa has really set itself in a direction where we're going to see a lot of change. So yes, we need to be able to come up with policies and rules and regulations as well that are really more fit to the African context, because, it is a different continent. I agree with Alistair in that, I think times have changed, and it's important that we recognize that times have changed. The colonization agenda and all that, it's kind of behind us. And I think it's time to start to look at Africa on an equal level playing field, right? To understand actually what are the opportunities. And it's important, I think, for Africa, yes, to engage, but actually Africa also has to be in the driving seat when it comes to African issues. And it's very, very important, I think, for Africa itself to actually set the vision, which is what we're doing with the Continental Free Trade Area. And it's very much setting a very clear vision around what is there, and everything within the CFTA really calls on, the ethos of collaboration, the ethos of, working in power, working at equal level playing field, driving investment. So 100%, I think that question is yes, Africa is there, and Africa is open for business, which is very, very exciting. And I have seen across, be it in Europe or the United States or here in the UK, everybody's starting to engage in Africa on an equal level playing field, and I think it should remain that way. But Africa also has to have its own say around, sort of the regulations and the rules that come.
Thank you, Michelle. And I think that is, for me, the very short conclusion as well. There is need for cooperation, not just on a regional level, on a global level as well. Borders serve certain purposes, but when it comes to digital, it is especially important that we keep borders open or avoid as many borders as possible. They have to be smart and intelligent, and that's what we are hoping to get through MC12, to have a roadmap to continue. And I think there is much more to say about this, but the time is short. We were given 5 more minutes, so we've used them all. Thank you very much for joining, and see you all around, either virtually or hopefully soon in a physical way again. Bye.
Thank you.